Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dive. This time, we're taking a deep dive into Alan Watts's lecture series. Do you do it, or does it? Do you? Ever get that feeling like life just kind of happens to you, like you're just along for the ride?
Yeah, that feeling of being a pinball bouncing around.
Exactly. Well, Watts challenges that whole idea. We're going to unpack some pretty wild concepts,
Mm.
really get into how we're connected to the universe.
It's amazing how Watts takes on this feeling of separation that a lot of people have. He uses these everyday examples, things like hiccups or thunderstorms.
Things we all experience but have zero control over.
Yeah, and he even brings in like scientific and religious views,
Mhm.
how we often feel like we don't really belong in the universe, like we're a bit out of place.
Hmm. So is he saying science and religion are both wrong?
Not really. It's more like he's arguing they both have these limited perspectives. It's like if
Okay.
you're looking at a newspaper photo, but you're only using a magnifying glass, you just see dots.
You got to zoom out to get the whole picture. Makes sense. I mean, we get so caught up in our day-to-day, all the little things that bug us, that we miss the bigger picture. But how do we zoom out in real life?
That's where the idea of levels of magnification comes in. It's like, think about looking at your hand.
Right?
You see skin, lines, nails. But if you go under a microscope, it's a whole different world. Cells, molecules, all this activity going on.
Oh.
Watts is saying maybe we're just focused on the wrong level when it comes to ourselves and the universe.
So what happens when we do zoom out on our lives? What's that bigger picture look like?
He uses this really powerful example, the bloodstream. At a microscopic level, it's a battleground. Cells are fighting off invaders.
Oh, wow.
But when you zoom out, you see that conflict is actually crucial for your health.
Hmm.
What seems chaotic at one level creates harmony at another.
So maybe the things I'm stressing over, the stuff that feels like it's happening to me, could actually be part of a bigger harmony. One I just can't see yet.
It makes you think, right?
Totally. It makes you wonder how much we miss when we only focus on the negative.
Yeah.
And, speaking of perspective shifts, Watts talks about space too, doesn't he?
Absolutely. And this is where it gets really mind-blowing. We usually think of space as empty, right? Nothing important.
Yeah.
But Watts flips that on its head. He says space is what actually connects things. Think about it. No space between stars. No individual stars. You need that separation.
To define a form, to have individual experiences.
Right. So instead of being this tiny blip of consciousness, you're actually part of a huge pattern, all linked by space itself.
Wow. He doesn't stop there, does he? The candle flame analogy, right?
Oh, yeah. He compares the body to a candle flame. Not a fixed thing, but a constant flow of energy.
Transforming fuel into light, into heat.
And he says we're like that too. A delightfully complex undulation of the energy of the whole universe, he says.
I love that. So I'm not just this solid me, but a process, a verb, a dance of energy that really challenges how we normally think about ourselves.
For sure. It totally reframes how we see identity. And it leads us to another cool idea, the rhythms of existence.
Ah,
We experience time in this linear way, but the universe, all sorts of time scales happening, incredibly fast, like light on our eyes, and incredibly slow, like the lifespan of a star.
like that spinning cigarette example, right?
Mm.
In a dark room, it looks like a complete circle of fire, but it's just a single point of light moving super fast.
Perfect example. Watts is showing us how our perception creates that sense of continuity, even though things are always changing. We fixate on the slow rhythm of our own lives, with birth and death as these endpoints. But he's suggesting maybe it's all just part of a much bigger cycle, a huge cosmic dance we can't fully grasp from our limited point of view.
So maybe all this doom and gloom, we're bombarded with climate change, all of that is just us focused on the wrong time scale.
That's a very Wattsian way to put it. He compares us to skydivers who get so locked onto the target below they forget to pull the ripcord.
Oh, wow.
We're so worried about disaster that we can't see the bigger picture, the possibility that these events are just part of a rhythm we don't understand yet. And this brings us back to control, you know?
Control. How
Yeah.
so?
Well, so often we feel like things are happening to us outside our control. He uses this analogy of a gyroscope. You hold it and it seems to have its own life, resists your grip. He says life's kind of like that, always slipping away from our attempts to totally control it.
But we're supposed to have some control over our lives, right? If we
Mm.
just let go, won't everything fall apart?
That's where it gets really interesting. Watts isn't saying we should just give up making choices or taking action. It's more about realizing that the feeling of things being out of control is actually what makes control meaningful.
So it's like you can't have light without darkness, up without down, Control and lack of control define each other.
Exactly. It's about finding a new way to relate to that tension, to the unpredictable nature of things. And he uses another cool analogy, how our consciousness works like a radar system, always scanning for threats, for problems.
Oh, so that's why we always focus on what's going wrong, instead of appreciating all the good stuff.
Yeah. Our brains are wired to problem solve. It's tied to this thing in Gestalt psychology, how we focus on the figure, not the background. What's moving, what's changing. Those things feel more real to us.
So the question is, are we so busy troubleshooting that we miss the bigger picture, that background of stability and interconnectedness?
And that leads us to this radical idea Watts throws out. What if our language itself is part of the problem? We're so hung up on nouns, on things, but maybe everything is really patterns, processes,
Wow.
verbs.
He actually wants a language with only verbs. I can't even imagine that. But yeah, I get it. We're obsessed with labeling, with finding solid things, that we totally miss the flow, the dynamism.
He gives the example of gold versus lead. They're both made of atoms. The arrangement, the pattern is what makes them different. Or think about dances. A waltz versus a mazurka. It's all about the energy, the process, the verb.
So instead of seeing myself as this fixed me, I should be thinking of myself as a constantly evolving verb,
Right.
always becoming, always changing.
Exactly. It reframes what the self even is. You're not a noun, you're a verb, a dynamic process. And speaking of dynamic processes, this is where we get into how Watts reinterprets karma.
Okay, let's dive into that in part 2. This is getting really interesting.
So yeah, Watts' idea about seeing ourselves as verbs, not nouns, it really challenges how we usually think about karma, at least here in the West.
Yeah, we tend to think of it as this like cosmic system of getting what you deserve. Good deeds, good karma, bad deeds, bad karma.
Almost like some cosmic scorekeeper, right?
Yeah,
Tallying up our good and bad points.
exactly. It always felt kind of simplistic to me.
For sure. Watts is really emphasizing that karma is more about interdependence. He uses this phrase, this arises, that becomes,
Right.
to show how everything's connected, how one thing leads to another, just this constant flow.
So less about punishment or reward, more about understanding how everything's linked together.
You got it. He even brings in this Japanese concept, Jiji Mooch.
Jiji Mooch.
It basically means the mutual interpenetration of all things. Think of it like you drop a drop of ink into a glass of water.
Okay.
It doesn't stay separate. It spreads out, mixes with the water. That's Jiji Mooch. Everything's interwoven, influencing each other.
So our actions, our choices, they're like that drop of ink, creating ripples that affect the whole system.
Exactly. And that system isn't just the physical world. Our thoughts, our emotions, our relationships, all part of it, all woven together.
Wow. We should really think about the impact of even the smallest things we do, you know.
It is humbling, but also empowering, because it challenges this Western idea that we're just isolated individuals responsible only for ourselves. Watts points out that this whole idea of a separate self, a doer, apart from the world, it's an illusion.
But if everything's connected like that, doesn't that mean we don't have free will? Are we just puppets?
That's a common misconception. Watts isn't saying we have no agency, that we're powerless. He's trying to broaden our understanding of what free will even is, to put it within this context of interdependence.
So instead of free will being this total control, it's more like it comes from this interplay of all the forces around us, both inside and outside.
Exactly. Imagine a jazz musician. They're improvising a solo.
Okay.
They're using their skill, their knowledge of music, the energy of the other musicians, the mood of the audience. Their choices aren't fixed beforehand, but they're not happening in a vacuum either.
That's a great analogy. So our choices are shaped by so many things, but we still have the freedom to respond, to create something new within those limits.
That's it. And it brings us back to Watts's central question, do you do it or does it do you? It's all about exploring this relationship between our individual actions and these bigger forces at work.
So how do we even begin to shift our perspective? How do we break free from this idea that we're just isolated egos trying to control everything?
Watts talks about paying attention to the spaces between things.
Spaces.
Think about artists, musicians. They get this. A painter knows the background defines the foreground. A musician knows that silence between the notes. That's what gives the music its rhythm, its depth.
So it's not just about the stuff, it's
Yeah.
also the spaces, the connections, the context.
Yeah. He even talks about the spaces between people, those unspoken connections and dynamics that shape how we interact. It's about noticing those hidden influences, those energies that are always at play.
Almost like tuning into a different frequency, becoming aware of these patterns we normally miss.
And that awareness can be incredibly freeing. It helps us step back from that struggle for control, that anxiety of trying to force everything to fit our plans.
So instead of fighting the current, we learn to swim with it, to trust the flow of life.
Beautifully put. And that trust doesn't come from blind faith. It comes from a deeper understanding of how everything is interconnected.
But how do we actually get that understanding? It all sounds very philosophical, you know? How do we apply these ideas to our daily lives?
Watts was a big believer in mindfulness,
Mindfulness.
the practice of paying attention to the present moment without judgment.
So just being aware of what's happening right now, not getting lost in our thoughts about it.
That's it. It's about observing those thoughts, feelings, sensations without getting swept away. And as we cultivate that mindfulness, we start to see the interconnectedness of everything.
Like how my breath right now connects me to the air, the trees, the whole planet.
Exactly. You start to see we're not these separate things, but part of this huge web of life, always exchanging energy, information with everything around us.
And that awareness can extend to our relationships too, right?
Absolutely. We start seeing those spaces between people, like Watts says, those unspoken connections, the shared humanity that binds us all together. We're all in this together, sharing this journey, even though our individual experiences might be different.
It's like that saying, we're all just walking each other home. We're
Mm.
companions on this journey. But we forget that sometimes. Get caught up in our own little dramas.
And that's where mindfulness, this awareness of interconnectedness, can really help. We can step back from those dramas, see things from a wider perspective. We become less judgmental, more compassionate, more understanding.
Sounds like a much more peaceful, fulfilling way to live. But how do we actually cultivate this mindfulness? It seems like a tall order these days, you know, with everything going on.
Watts was a big advocate for meditation. He saw it as this powerful tool for quieting the mind, for connecting with that deeper sense of being that's always there, beneath all the thoughts and emotions.
So creating a space for stillness, for silence,
Yeah.
where we can tap into that underlying interconnectedness.
That's it. And it doesn't have to be some big, complicated thing. Even just a few minutes a day can make a difference.
It's like hitting the pause button on all that mental noise.
Yeah.
Allowing ourselves to just be. I like that.
And as we do that, we might find our view of the world starts to shift. We see the beauty, the connection in everything, even in the tough times. We become more present, more engaged, more grateful for just existing.
Like we're tuning in to a different channel. One that's broadcasting harmony, connection, instead of fear and separation.
Beautifully put. And that shift in perspective can have a huge impact on how we live our lives.
Okay, so what are some of those impacts? How does this awareness actually show up in our everyday lives? So we've been talking about how mindfulness, recognizing this interconnectedness, can change our perspective, but how does that actually change how we live?
Well, one big thing is it changes our relationship with control. We talked about that gyroscope analogy, right? Life resisting our attempts to totally control it.
Right. Like the more we grip, try to force things, the more pushback we get.
Exactly. And a lot of that struggle to control comes from fear, fear of the unknown, fear of things not going our way, fear of losing what we have.
So if we let go of some of that fear, maybe we can find a different way to relate to the world. One that's less about controlling and more about, going with the flow.
Watts wouldn't necessarily say going with the flow. He actually uses the term engaged surrender.
Engage surrender.
Yeah, it's about recognizing we can't control everything, but we can choose how we respond.
So it's not passive. It's finding that balance between putting in effort, but also allowing things to be as they are.
Exactly. He uses the example of sailing a boat. You can't control the wind, right?
Yeah.
But you can adjust your sails to use that power, navigate your course.
Oh, I like that. So we do have agency, but it's not about forcing our will in the world. It's more like working with the forces around us, almost like a dance.
Exactly, a dance. And this engaged surrender, it applies to everything. Relationships, work, creative stuff. It's about finding that sweet spot, taking responsibility for our actions, but also realizing we're part of something bigger.
Okay, yeah. I'm seeing how all this fits together. We start by seeing that we're not these isolated egos. We're part of this web. Then we do the mindfulness thing to really feel those connections. And that lets us loosen the grip, surrender a bit, but still make conscious choices.
You got it. And as we embrace that engaged surrender, we often find we actually feel more agency, more freedom.
It's like that paradox, right? The more we try to grab onto things, the more they slip away.
Yeah.
But letting go, trusting, that's where we find freedom within the dance.
Watts reminds us that change is the very nature of life. He uses that candle flame image, it's always flickering, changing, but it keeps its form. We're like that too, always changing, growing, but still ourselves somehow.
Like that Heraclitus quote, right? No man ever steps in the same river twice.
There you go. And Watts would say that change, it's not something to fear, it's the very essence of life, of
It's
aliveness.
about letting go of those fixed ideas of who we are, what life should be, opening ourselves up to what's happening right now.
And that shift from seeing ourselves as separate egos to recognizing this connection with everything, that's what Watts believed could lead to a more joyful, meaningful life.
So it's not about denying the hard stuff, the struggles. It's about seeing them as part of this bigger picture, a cosmic dance we all have a role in.
Beautifully put. And as we cultivate this awareness, we might notice our fears and anxieties starting to fade, replaced by a sense of wonder, gratitude, just for being alive.
It's like a whole different way of experiencing the world. So if we had to summarize Watt's message for our listeners, what would it be? What's that one key takeaway?
I think it's this. You are not a separate being, struggling alone in a hostile universe. You're an essential part of this vast, interconnected web of life, this cosmic dance that's always unfolding in ways we can barely grasp.
And recognizing that connection, surrendering into the flow, embracing the mystery of it all, that just might be the key to finding more joy, more meaning, more purpose in life.
It's a journey of waking up to your true nature, a journey Alan Watts invites us all to take.
So as you go about your day, remember this. You're not just a random dot. You're an essential part of something incredible, a unique expression of the cosmos. A verb, a process, a dance. Embrace the dance.